Hello random people, welcome to Random Garage, the channel where we're always doing something. On this episode of Random Garage, we're reassembling the 2019 Fat Boy 114 with all the new powder coated and painted parts. All the black parts are nice fresh powder coat. The sprocket here I just taped off and then hand painted that with a spray can. Actually it's just red brake caliper paint and then clear coated over it. So I think it turned out good enough. On the back side of this dash piece there was these little rubber spacer bumper things that were stuck on there. Obviously those had to come off for the powder coating, and there's no mark left there exactly where they went. I kind of remember they were kind of like that, and these two are kind of close together, but I'm going to glue them on with the glue gun, just a little dab of hot glue, and stick them back in place. I could tell where they were on the tank because it was dirty underneath, and there's, if it'll show up on the camera, kind of little circles there and there where those little bumpers were. So I took the dash piece and lined it up, and I could see where the bumpers belong. Okay, I've got the dash piece reinstalled here. On these small non-critical fasteners that just hold decorative pieces on, not worried about a torque spec. Even if there is one, I don't even know, maybe there's not. But just make them tight, don't over tighten them, except for this one here did need blue Loctite. I could see that there was originally blue Loctite on there, so that got a little more blue medium strength Loctite. This headlight trim had these little rubber bumper pieces, and they kind of fell off when I pulled this headlight trim piece off, but they belong right there up in the corners. This trim piece has kind of hooks in the top here that set into these holes right there. So for installing it, hook the top into those holes and then push the bottom to snap it into place and replace the screw on the bottom. Okay, so now to reassemble the fender, put the rear turn signals back on the fender struts, and then ran the wires up the channel. The wires were held in before by like a 3M VHB strips along there, and they're destroyed. I just used hot glue to stick the wires in there, and seems like that'll hold it just fine. Now to reinstall these fender struts, start by doing the inner fender bolt, put some blue Loctite on there, and then torque it 21 to 27 foot-pounds using a T45 Torx. Then put the outer fender support screws back in, again with some blue Loctite and the same torque, 21 to 27 foot-pounds. So I'm gonna wait and put this fender on last because I think it's gonna be a lot easier to get the rear wheel reinstalled without having the fender in the way. So, but when it does go on, the fasteners that hold it to the bike get torqued to between 42 and 46 foot-pounds. So now to reassemble the wheels, always use new bearings. When you pull them out, you're pulling on the center and it's doing like a sideways load, and it can, if there's a lot of force to pull them out, that can screw up the bearings, the ball bearings inside. So always use new ones. The ABS bearing gets put in first. That of course goes on the brake disc side, both on the front wheel and the rear wheel. And again, the colored side, the red side, or orange, whatever you want to call it, there's also a groove in there. That side goes down towards the wheel. So we'll put the ABS bearing in, bottom it out fully as far as it can go, and then we'll put the spacer in, and then put the regular bearing in the other side and bottom it out against the spacer. I like to put a little bit of anti-seize in there. That just makes it easier to get the bearings out when they need to be changed out again. Now to use this installer tool, this inserter thing, you put the bearing over that and then kind of get it started in there a little bit. I usually give it a little tap with a hammer to kind of get it started. And on the other side, this disc is going to go in there. Then this long bolt is going to go all the way through. And the washer and the nut. We just fully tighten the nut down and it'll push that bearing right in and bottom it out. So that bearing's in. We drop the spacer in there. Don't forget that spacer. When you do put it in, you got to make sure it's nice and centered, and it'll kind of like drop down against the other bearing. There's a little like centering hole on the opposite side in there. So then just put the other bearing in, bottom it out against the spacer. Well, the spacer is not perfectly centered in the bearing, so the axle wouldn't go through there. It'd be a hard push. So then I take my big ratchet and there, got it. Now it's centered. Picked up these fancy valve stems for it, so I'll go ahead and just stick that through the hole and tighten up the nut on the other side. Next, I'll throw the tires on. If you can find a dot on the tire, you always line that up with the valve stem. Stock Harley Dunlops always have a dot, and if you always line it up with the valve stem, you very rarely have to rebalance the tire. Continuing on with assembly of the rear wheel, I've got the brake disc set on there. There's the screws for it. They take a T45 Torx. Always put a brake disc back on with brand new screws, but if you're using the old screws, I put a little blue Loctite on them, and when I torque them, I'll torque them to the high end of the torque spec. And they get torqued to between 30 and 45 foot-pounds. Got the sprocket set in place. And the sprocket screws are a odd torque sequence. Again, you're supposed to use brand new ones. I'm not, but I put extra blue Loctite on them. You put them in, first you torque them to 60 foot-pounds, then you back them off 180 degrees, so half a turn, and then torque them down to between 77 and 83 foot-pounds. The front disc screws take a T40 Torx. And again, always use new screws or your old ones with Loctite, extra Loctite, and they get torqued between 16 and 24 foot-pounds. So now I've got the wheel set in place. I'm gonna slide the axle back in and then screw it in. Don't forget about the spacer on the right side, and on the left side, have to get that ABS sensor back in there too. Of course, make sure you use the right spacer. It's the mid-length one, because the rear wheel has the shortest one on one side and the longest one on the other side. The front wheel just uses that, about 1 inch long. I guess I forgot to mention about putting a little extra anti-seize on the axle. It doesn't have to be in the center portion, but just there's a slightly fatter portion kind of on each end, and that's where it sits in the bearing and in the spacer and stuff, and that's where it needs some anti-seize. So then got the axle threaded in a little bit, and then the wheel speed sensor can rotate. You don't know where to put it. Then replace the pinch bolt that goes up in there. Remember, that's metric, so it's 6mm Allen, not a 1/4 inch Allen, and it gets torqued to between 11 and 15 foot-pounds. Some of the bikes have a pinch bolt that goes in this way instead of on the bottom, and I think it's a little larger screw, and it takes a larger torque between 20 and 25 foot-pounds. Finally, on the front here, we're gonna reinstall the caliper. Well, I've got that all wrapped around itself now, but there we go. Get that in place. When you reinstall the caliper, make sure that you also replace the little bracket that holds the speed sensor wire in place. And those are metric. They take that 12-point 10mm socket, and they get torqued between 28 and 38 foot-pounds. And then also these little clips that hold the wire to the brake line, put them in place in 3 spots there so that the wire is secured. Now to get this giant rear wheel back in place, as it rolls in, kind of come in at an angle and then rotate it into place. That'll get it like around the brake caliper and get the brake caliper to engage on the disc again. And at the same time, have the long spacer on the left side held in place, and it'll kind of pivot in, it'll slide into place there. And then it's the other spacer on the right side, plus the wheel speed sensor. So a little complicated, a lot of pieces to put together all at once, but it's possible. This little right side spacer I have put in there, and it's held in place by the caliper bracket, so it's kind of staying in place on its own. Then like I said, this spacer I have to hold in place as I rotate the wheel in here, and then my other hand I'll have to get the wheel speed sensor and get that up in there too at the same time as I push the wheel forward, and then at the same time try to, with my third hand, arrange the brake caliper so it goes back onto the disc. Okay, so I got everything into place. It was harder to get the wheel out. I think next time I do a wheel change, I'll just take the fender off first, because that's so easy, and it's so much easier than to work the wheel out. But so I've got everything in, and then I just put this long ratchet in there to hold the things on the right side in place, because then the axle is in from the left side, so that'll just kind of keep things aligned, and then the axle will just push the ratchet out as I push it through. So I've got the axle prepared with a light coat of anti-seize along its full length, and I'm just gonna tap it in there with my rubber mallet. And just like with the front wheel, the rear wheel speed sensor has a specific pin. It's got a little pin to stop it in a specific position, so it's supposed to just be rotated forward as far as it'll go until there's a little pin that hits part of the frame there. So that's the right position for it. Then the big axle nut is 95 to 105 foot-pounds, and then don't forget to put the safety clip back on after tightening that. And that nut takes a 1 7/16 inch socket. You know, I'm sure that's metric, but in that big size, that's what it comes out to for standard sizes. Nobody's got metric sockets that big. These 2 screws that hold the rear caliper in place, they take a little bit of blue Loctite, and then they get torqued 14 to 18 foot-pounds, and they're metric. They take a 12mm socket. This lower belt guard's kind of a jigsaw puzzle to get in, but you go up this way and then this way, and then so you got like the back portion around the sprocket, and then the front you got to kind of twist and wrestle with the belt to get it to go up in here, but it's possible, and it's plastic, so it's flexible. And of course the top one is real easy, so just throw the screws in to hold those, and then quick throw the whole rear fender assembly back on and the seat, and finally be done with this. So that's it, all back together.
Looks great. It is quite the load.
I totally forgot to balance the tires before I put them on. So we're going to do a road test, see if it rides smooth. If not, I was just going to put counteract tire beads, balancing beads in it anyway. So if it rides a little rough, I'll just start adding bead weight and get it smoothed out. If you want to see more Random Garage things, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you get a random notification when a new Random Garage video is posted. Thanks for watching another episode of Random Garage here in Sturgis, and remember, whatever you do, make sure you're always doing something.